Hey, everybody. I've got a little time this afternoon. I thought I would hop on and see how people are doing, see if anybody's got any questions or concerns, or see if anybody just wants to chat for a little while. Excuse me. So I'm going to throw this link in a few places, and then we can get rolling. Hi, Nico. My Latin's not great. I have studied it a bit, but luckily I have very good friends who are specialists in Latin. So if I have issues, I can go to them. Hi, everybody. I'm throwing this link on some different places, so give me a minute. Is "let God prevail" really one of the Hebraic translations of Israel? Kinda. Let God prevail means may God prevail. It's adjussive. It's like a third person imperative. The idea is, I hope God prevails. When people treat it as a second person imperative, as, hey, you need to let God or allow God to prevail, that is a misunderstanding. That is taking the confusing the construction in English that can have more than one sense. It's confusing the construction for a different sense than what is intended to be reflected. So it is a misunderstanding if it is being used to suggest that you should allow God to prevail. That is not what the text says, or that's not what the name means. Hi, Pedro. Good to see you. Matthew 27:52-53 mentions that raised spirits went through the holy city and appeared to many after Christ was raised. Are there any writings that document this? No. Hey, Dan, when did the Christians stop seeing other gods as gods and as demons in disguise? I would say the idea that they were angels or demons predates the rise of Christianity. However, there still is recognition that they are divine, that they're gods in some sense in many places. So it continues into late antiquity. But demons in disguise, that sounds like something that is kind of an ad hoc argument for why a particular text may use the word God. How can I use a knowledge of Latin in academic biblical studies? There's lots of uses for it. Studying the Vulgate, studying the history of Rome. There's a lot of Latin inscriptions that are relevant to the study of the rise of Christianity, the study of Judaism, the study of the interaction between the Roman Empire, and both. There are lots of ways to use Latin. Hi, Dan, from Arlington, Texas. How do scholars arrive at Mark being the earliest of the four Gospels? It is the shortest. It is the most basic. It lacks many details. Matthew and Luke both share certain things in common with Mark, sometimes that they share in common with each other, sometimes that they don't. So all the data suggests that Matthew, Luke, and John are later elaborations on, expansions on, developments on the tradition that we see reflected in Mark. And so it is, and a lot of the discussion in Mark is theologically more basic and reflects an earlier historical period, slightly earlier. Is the NT concept of fornication the same as the OT? No. The NT concept of fornication is based on Greco-Roman ideas of what is sexually proper. Now, Greco-Roman period Judaism is also influenced by the Greco-Roman perspective. And that has influenced the composition and the redaction of some of the literature in the Hebrew Bible. However, the majority reflects Persian or earlier ideas, which are different ideas about what is proper and improper sex. Howdy, punk rock polygamists. Hope you're doing all right. Kirk recently became a big fan of yours and caught your D&D game, which was awesome. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I was putting myself out there a little bit. That's the first time I've ever played. I didn't really know what I was doing, but my family and I are making plans to go to Dragon Con. So I would love to be able to do some of this in person. Lost fan, thank you so much for the super chat. Dr. McClellan, do you ever get exhausted of addressing the same claims over and over, like the Revelation angels at the Euphrates and similar? Yes and no. It is annoying when it keeps popping up. It feels like I am not making a difference when people are getting an awful lot of attention making these same claims over and over again. But at the same time, it makes for a quicker work day if I already know what I have to say, and I can just say, oh, blah, 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 blah. Video's done, full send. And then, it shaves a lot of time off of my schedule. So as my audience shifts and changes, and just as time progresses, there are going to be people who forget about or who need who have never seen this before, who I think would be helped by seeing it. And so I'm always going to need to repeat things. That's just the nature of this kind of activity, this kind of work, what I'm doing. And so it gets, sometimes it can be a little demoralizing if it's obvious that these claims are not going away. But at the same time, there are things that make it a little easier for me. Afternoon, sir. What do you think is the biggest evolution in the character / nature of God by the biblical authors? I would say the main one, I think the shift that really changed things was the shift from Adonai as soon as they were merged with El in early Israel, they were considered the head of the pantheon in the heavens. They were not considered to have direct political rule over the nations of the earth. Every nation had their own patron deity. Adonai's nation was Israel, so that was their purview. And if you were outside of the nation of Israel, you were under the purview of a different deity. And there are a lot of different ways that this bubbles to the surface, excuse me, in the rhetoric of the Hebrew Bible. But once we get into the exile, now the Judahites are outside of the nation of Israel and they're under the purview of other deities. And so they're trying to renegotiate their relationship to the God of Israel. And there are a couple of different things that are innovated as a way to respond to this crisis. And one of them, which I argue in a Journal of Biblical Literature article in 2018, the main rhetorical move that accomplished this is found in Psalm 82. But basically that God took over rule of the nations, and the patron deities get subordinated to politically the God of Israel, who's now God over all nations, God over all the earth. I would say, and so much flows downstream from that rhetorical renegotiation. So I would say that's the biggest thing. Monotheism doesn't come up in the Bible. That's a post-biblical innovation. That also flows downstream from this universalization of Adonai. Aaron's staff, Exodus 7 turns into a tanin. I've heard Joel Baden say it's crocodile, not serpent / snake. I can't read Hebrew, wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Tanin is a word that can mean a serpent, a snake, a sea monster. It can mean crocodile. So there's nothing in the text that cues us to it meaning a specific thing over against another thing. So it's basically whichever concept resonates the most with us, makes the text most meaningful to us. So I couldn't make an argument that Joel's wrong, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that Joel is right. So this is one of those things where I would just suspend judgment, say we can't know for sure. Hey, Dan, you've said some harsh things about systematic theologians. I don't know that I've said harsh things about systematic theologians. I say harsh things about apologists, but systematic who try to work with Scripture. Do you think all systematic theology is just rationalizations? I think all theology is rationalizations, and I think even critical scholarship to some degree is rationalizations as well. Systematic theology is an attempt to try to impose a unifying framework, but if you have worthy goals for doing that, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's when it is used to structure power, values, and boundaries over and against the interests of marginalized, minoritized, or oppressed groups that I have a big problem. And that's primarily what apologists are doing. Lost Fan, thank you for another super chat. What would you say is your overarching goal with this work? Like, if you could wave a magic wand and make your work complete, how is the world different? People are not spreading misinformation about the Bible and religion. So I'm directly confronting the misinformation to the degree that I'm able. And then I am also trying to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion so that other people can develop the skills and the resources to be able to confront misinformation themselves. So I'm both confronting the misinformation and trying to equip and train to, if you want to call it that, the public to try to think more critically about that misinformation so that the ability to recognize and confront and mitigate the spread of misinformation is proliferated throughout the public. But I don't think that work will ever be complete. But thank you for the question. Have you ever read the book God is Red by Vine Deloria Jr.? I'm afraid I haven't even heard of that book or that author, but I will check it out. The Second Coming of Dan's Beard. It's getting there. Hey, Dan, do you play any video games? I have. I grew up, we were the first house in our neighborhood. We were the poorest house in our neighborhood, but my dad decided he was going to invest in an original Nintendo when it first came out. So we played a lot of original Nintendo. Sega. I got a Super Nintendo, and then I went away to college. I played GoldenEye at college. That's the last video game I can remember playing consistently or regularly, and that was 1998. And I have not played video games regularly since then. Although I did get my girls a Nintendo Switch for Christmas, and so I'm starting to pick up some things again, but just occasionally. So this biblical bromance, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and he loved him as himself. Does this hint that they were more than friends in the source text that you're aware from 1 Sam 18? I've made a couple of videos where I've said, I don't know that we have enough data to say that it's probable that they were romantic or were not. I suspend judgment on that question because I don't think we have enough data. I think there are plausible arguments for reading this as Platonic, and I think there are plausible arguments for reading it as something more. So I don't know. And I think people who feel strongly that it has to be one way or another feel strongly because that makes it more meaningful for them or that serves their interests. But I don't know. Have you read those Invincible books yet? Yes, I have gotten through one of them. I've skimmed the other two, but I'm slowly plodding through. So it's a fun story. I haven't watched any of the animated series yet. I will probably get to that at some point. But I need to talk to Ryan. I was thinking it would be fun to have a Ryan Otley done drawing of me. To put on a shirt, and I could use it for to raise money or for charity or something like that. But would that be a fun piece of merch, a Ryan Otley done drawing of me with like a Data Over Dogma shirt on saying, all right, let's see it, or something like that. I think that might be pretty fun. And hopefully he wouldn't charge me too much money to do that. Did you like the series Ring of Power on Amazon? I thought it moved a little slowly. I thought the story was good when things happened. So yeah, it was. I thought it was good. Did Dr. McClellan, would you consider making an online class on the law codes? That would be interesting. I should do that. I would need to do quite a bit of prep on that, though, because there is a lot of secondary literature I would need to catch up on. But that's a great idea. Thank you, Lord Roku. I think that would be very cool. Lost Fan, thank you so much for another Super Chat question. Comment on historicity of Balaam and Balak. So we do have a text that's known as the Dear Allah inscription, written in a language that seems kind of Aramaic-y, but also not, that talks about Balaam as kind of a prophet for hire. But it dates to, if I recall correctly, around 800 BCE. So it's nowhere near the time that these events are placed in the book of Numbers. So the story as told in the book of Numbers is definitely not historical, but there probably was someone who was a blesser and curser for hire in around 800 BCE who went by that name. But the story of Balaam and Balak, probably not historical. Philip North. Hi, Philip. Hope you're doing all right. Thank you so much for the question. Can you recommend a good primer or grammar to get reacquainted with biblical Greek? I took the first 2 semesters of Koine in college, but that was 20 years ago, and I'd like to brush up. I've been wondering about that too. I taught a Greek, an online Greek class a few years ago. I'm trying to remember what I used. Give me just 1 second. I do have some PDFs of some Greek. No, that's not it. Let's see. William Mounce's book, Basics of Biblical Greek. That seems like a bigger. Yeah, that's a bigger grammar. That's not really a primer. I know I have a couple of. Okay, here's one. I think I may have used this one. Yeah. Rodney Decker did one, Reading Koine Greek, an introduction and integrated workbook. Baker Academic was the publisher. It dates to 2014 is when it was published. And I think Decker may have been. No, that's somebody else. I think I liked it. Let me try to go through it. Yeah, I think I did like this one. It's not very expensive. I think it was very intuitive. It was very user friendly for brushing up on Greek. I think it does a good job. So let me. Give me just 1 second to get back to the front or the cover, whatever you call that part of the book. Okay. So that's what it looks like. I think I got through, if not the whole thing, most of it when I was doing this online Greek class that I was doing. So I think that's probably your best bet. At least from what I know of, there are going to be other people who are a lot more involved in teaching biblical Greek who would probably have more info for you. Chemist S, thank you so much for the super chat. Can you recommend a book that discusses what is likely to be the true life, ministry, and death of Jesus? So that would be a historical Jesus book. there are a handful that are out there. I would recommend one that I enjoyed. I've talked to some scholars of social memory who say this has problems related to social memory, but I still think there's a lot of info in there. Is Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Before the Gospels, which uses social memory to try to see what can we reconstruct from the Gospels that we could say what is likely historical, what is not historical, what are what he calls gist memories, that they are social memories that are more or less what the story was, but the details might be a little foggy. So that's probably the one that I would, that's probably the one I would recommend. Ethan Lamar, thank you so much for the question. The LDS Church teaches a three-tiered heaven, for lack of a better term, and I've heard them cite NT verses for this belief. Is this a reimagination, or does it have basis in historical belief? Well, you have Paul saying he was caught up to the third heaven, and you have Paul talking about different, the glory of stars being different from each other, and the glory of the sun and the glory of the moon. And so it's not a reconstruction of how they thought of things in the first century CE, but I mean, it's no less plausible than a lot of other reconstructions of Paul's cosmology. So there are some scriptures that are proof texted to rationalize the idea. But yeah, a three-tiered heaven is something that would have had some currency back then. Also a seven-tiered heaven. David Mullins, thank you so much for the question. Do the existence of chiastic structures in Genesis tell us anything about its redaction process or help explain constant repetition / parallel stories? I would say no. Chiasms are something that are a little passé. That they were popular for a little bit, but these days scholars consider chiasms to be more the product of the creativity of the scholar than the work of the author, unless there's a strong case that can be made. And there are a lot of other ways that composition of Genesis there are a lot of other things, considerations that complicate theories about the composition of Genesis that are not just overcome by chiasms. That does not cut the Gordian knot of the complexities of Genesis. And a good book on what's going on in the different literary layers of Genesis would be David Carr's book, Reading the Fractures of Genesis. I would recommend that to anybody wanting to know what kind of evidence is there for the literary layers and the literary seams that scholars believe are there in Genesis. Agrifos, thank you for the question. Recommendation on book for learning biblical Hebrew. I learned from the textbook by a scholar named Lambden. That's a very old one. Winegreen is another very old one. There is, where to go? I do have another biblical Hebrew textbook. I think it is by I forget the publishing arm of Logos Bible Software, but they publish an introduction to biblical Hebrew. I really enjoyed this. This was by a handful of different people. It is out of Yale, Biblical Hebrew Text and Workbook. This is the second edition. This is out of print, though. It evidently was not incredibly popular. But rather than go through and structure everything around grammar and syntax principles, everything is structured around texts from the Hebrew Bible. And so each lesson is based on a passage from the Hebrew Bible. So here is lesson number 2, and it is Exodus 6:2. And then they use that passage to then explain some of the more basic principles of the grammar and the syntax and everything like that. I thought this was pretty helpful. The world evidently did not. So it is out of print. I think these are probably difficult to get a hold of. The first edition, which is very similar, I think you could probably find a PDF online without too much difficulty. But I don't know how much it would cost to get a hard copy of this. Now, I am making plans I'm trying to figure out a way to make it feasible to teach an intro to biblical Hebrew the second half of this year. I haven't decided yet if it will be an intensive one or a regular one, if it's going to be like 2 50-minute classes a week for 3 months, or if I'm going to do something where it's hour or 2-hour classes once or twice a week for a handful of weeks. I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm thinking about doing that closer to the end of this year, after I have a number of larger projects off my plate. But I don't know what the price point on that is going to be yet, because it's going to take up an awful lot of time. So I have to figure out how to make it something that I can do well, but also that is not going to totally screw up my regular workday. So I will keep everybody posted on that. Nate S., thank you so much for the question. Do you think that being high will help those that want to read Revelation? I don't think it will help them get any closer to what was intended by the author of Revelation. I do think it will probably assist them in trying to find ways to make it meaningful or interesting to them. But so it depends on what your goals are for approaching the book of Revelation. Sebastian Elder, just thanking you for sober scholarship. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. That was very kind of you. Fire Tools, thank you so much. How do you approach more mystical and or non-duality interpretations of Scripture? I'm thinking of the writings of figures like Meister Eckhart, for example, or perhaps the Cloud of Unknowing. I generally don't do a lot of work with those folks, so I don't have to deal with a lot of the mystical side of things. But I recognize that there is an element of there are an awful lot of folks who enjoy that approach, who get more significance out of it, who for whom it, or with whom it resonates. But I'm not one of those. I'm have always been kind of a I'm always thinking about the historical, critical, the material side of things, and so yeah, I think I leave that for folks who are going to enjoy it more and who are going to do a better job of trying to engage it on its own terms, because I'm probably not going to be able to engage it on its own terms from an academic point of view. I'm going to be one who is trying to reduce it to something that makes more sense to me from my perspectives, from cognitive linguistics, cognitive science of religion, historical criticism, things like that. So I've dabbled in, I've read some things from folks like Meister Eckhart and others, but I've basically just tried to enjoy the experience and then move on without trying to think too hard about it. So I'm sorry if that's not a good enough answer, or not as satisfactory an answer, but yeah, I don't deal too much with that side of things. Do you have any thoughts on parallels with Moses and Jesus in Matthew? I see an infographic circulating about it. Yeah, there's this idea that there are 5 cycles within the story of Matthew, and this is supposed to represent the 5 books of Moses, and Jesus is the new Moses, and Jesus is kind of superseding Moses in a lot of ways. I think there's something to that, but at the same time, I think that scholars can often read more into it than is there. In fact, I think there are scholars these days who are pushing back against the notion that the 5-fold division of Matthew is something that is intentionally set up to parallel the 5 books of Moses. So I'm not up to date on that discussion. Apologize for the chewing. It's snack time, so. Is it true that Egypt was ruling the areas the Israelites supposedly fled to during the supposed Exodus? Yes. Egypt's hegemony in the northern hill country would recede around the end of the 13th, beginning of the 12th century BCE. And it's shortly after that the Philistines show up, and there's kind of a power vacuum. And so the rise of Israel may correspond with that power vacuum. We see a handful of territorial states that are also referred to as secondary states that pop up: Moab, the Edomites, Israel, some others. The Philistines could be in the same category. that pop up when Egypt's influence is waning in that region. But yeah, 15th, 14th century, Egypt has pretty secure rule over that area. Hi, Kippy. Thanks for swinging by. Depends on which divine council. Yeah, Avengers. Avengers have some gods there, so depending on whether or not you think Thor is a patron deity, then Thor would be on the divine council. So, yeah, that's an interesting bit of counterfactual history. Any good books to read that deal with the Exodus? There's one that I've recommended a handful of times that that I think does a pretty good job of covering a bunch of different aspects of the Exodus. And it is called Israel's Exodus in Transdisciplinary Perspective, Text, Archaeology, Culture, and Geoscience. And if we go down here to the table of contents, it's coming. Okay. You have several parts. Part 1, interdisciplinary approaches to the Exodus narrative. Part 2, science-based approaches to the Exodus. Part 3, cyber archaeology and Exodus. Part 4, the Exodus narrative in its Egyptian and Near Eastern context. Part 5, the Exodus narrative as text. Part 6, the Exodus in later reception and perception. Part 7, the Exodus as cultural memory. Part 8, the Exodus and the emergence of Israel, new perspectives from biblical studies and archaeology. And then Thomas Schneider provides a conclusion. So I think this covers a lot of different areas associated with the Exodus, and I think does a better job than most. Jonathan asked, is Exodus a story about the Bronze Age collapse? No, I don't think so. If you want a story on the Bronze Age collapse, that would be Eric Klein's book, 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed. I've got the book on my shelf, but I can just pull up the book is called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed. Yes, which is an award-winning book, and he's just now come out with I think it's called After 1177. Let me see if that's correct. Yes, after 1177 BC, the survival of civilization, and that's coming out in April. So I would highly recommend that book. The 1177 was phenomenal. I read that book over a 24-hour period. I was working for the LDS Church as a scripture translation supervisor. I was on my way to an island called Tarawa, part of the nation of Kiribati in the south, in Micronesia. And I had to do a 24-hour layover on Fiji to get there. And so I was staying in a little bungalow on the beach in Nandi, Fiji, for 24 hours. In fact, it was a little more than, it was like 28 hours before I flew there. And I just got the book, and I read the entire thing in my little bungalow over the course of that day before flying on to Tarawa. But it was funny. Our plane landed from LAX to Nandi was like 5 a.m. that we got there, and we show up to the hotel, and they're like, check-in is at 2. I was like, it's 5 a.m. What am I gonna do for 9 hours? And they were like, you're on the beach. There are hammocks in between palm trees on the beach. Go take a nap. And so I was like, touche. I will go find a hammock. And I just slept in a hammock on the beach in Nandi, Fiji, waiting to check into my hotel. It was the loveliest layover I think I've ever had. Alex Peacock, thank you for the kind words. Hope you're enjoying things. As an Episcopalian, is that? I think yeah. So I don't know if anybody saw, but on Monday, the episode of the Data Over Dogma podcast that's going to drop on Monday features, in part, there are 2 parts to the episode, but one part is an interview with Joel McHale. And Joel McHale's brother is, I think he is a priest, and I think he's Episcopalian. I don't remember. And Joel says he is attending a Methodist congregation right now. So, but if you check out my TikTok channel, and I think I've posted it on my YouTube channel as well, I've got a little teaser for the episode. Did Hebrew evolve much over the centuries that it took to write the OT/Hebrew Bible? Is there a lot of difference between the Hebrew of its oldest and most recent books? Yes, Hebrew did change an awful lot. It was a period of almost 1,000 years. And if you would like to understand how that went down, Bill Schneedeman has a book called A Social History of Hebrew, Its Origins Through the Rabbinic Period, which I think is a very fascinating discussion of how Hebrew changed over those centuries. So if you're interested in more, that would be a great place to go. Hey, Dan, where did the doctrine of the inerrancy of the OT come from? I've been told it came from Rabbi Maimonides. That would probably be the most systematic approach to it, but there have been a lot of different ways that the rabbis and others have approached how to think about, the Hebrew Bible and its origins and how the texts relate to each other. So that would probably be the iteration that has been most influential throughout history, but I doubt that would be the very origin of the concept. Are you a fan of useful charts, biblical content? I am. I think I appreciate what that creator is doing. I think those charts are very cool, and I think they just came out with a timeline of the Bible. I would quibble with some of the conclusions that they endorse, but that's true of any scholarship that anybody produces. Have you ever watched or read The Name of the Rose? Sean Connery's character is very intellectually driven in a dogmatic environment and thought it might resonate with you. I've heard of it. I've never watched it or read it. I'll have to look it up. Matt Russell, thank you so much for the super chat. Do you see a connection between the parallel stories of Abraham's blessing followed by the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah compared to the parable of Good Samaritan, specifically the role of hospitality, generosity? I think so Abraham's, if you mean blessing by Melchizedek in Genesis 14, I think that is part of an entirely different stream of tradition from the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason I think that is because I and many other scholars think that Salem, where Melchizedek is high priest and king, it seems, is probably actually Sodom, and somebody changed it. Because if you look in the text, you're bouncing back and forth between who Abraham is talking to in a way that is suggestive of some textual manipulation. So let me pull up the text and I'll explain exactly what I mean. But to answer the question, obviously the idea of hospitality is salient in that story, as well as in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Good Samaritan. But I think the Good Samaritan story the lesson is very different there. Okay, Genesis 14 from the NRSV. So, so we got the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are fleeing. Some fell into these pits. The rest fled to the hill country. The enemy took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and went their way. They took Lot, who lived in Sodom and is good. Abram chases after them. He went in pursuit as far as Dan. Okay, he divided his forces against them by night, routed them, and pursued them to Hobath, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the goods and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods and the women and the people. So he has chased the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah down, and because they took stuff and Lot, and he's bringing back the stuff and Lot. Now it says after his return from the defeat and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shava. That is the king's valley. So he's just defeated the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so now it's evidently the new person who has taken over as king. And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of the God Most High. And he blessed him, said, "Blessed be Abram by the God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, blessed, blah, 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 blah." And then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." So Abram is coming back with the stuff that was stolen, including Lot and people. And the king of Sodom, who we have the king of Sodom comes out to meet Abram. Abram is talking to Melchizedek. And then the king of Sodom is talking to Abram. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I've sworn to the Lord God Most High, maker of heaven and earth." Now, remember, Melchizedek is the priest of Elyon, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and has just invoked that name. And now Abram is talking to the king of Sodom and talking about Elyon, God Most High. Blah, 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 blah. So I will take nothing but what the young men have do. And then it says that Abram gave him 1/10 of everything, and to Melchizedek. So basically, we've got king of Sodom coming out. Abram's talking to Melchizedek. Abraham gives Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. King of Sodom says, "No, just give me the people, keep all the goods." And then Abraham says to the king of Sodom, "No, I'm not going to do that." And so we seem to have this weird back and forth where the person is switching between the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. And Bob Cargill has a book out called Melchizedek, King of Sodom, that makes a strong argument that originally Melchizedek was the king of Sodom. And this changed because this other story about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was brought in and added to this corpus that would become the book of Genesis. And now the editors are like, we can't have Abram paying tithes, and the tithes are really just Abram saying, "Hey, I defeated the people who took all the stuff. I'm going to give you back 1/10 of the stuff." This is not Abram saying, "I am giving 1/10 of my income to the priests to show that I'm devoted to God." This is Abram saying, "Hey, I won back your stuff, so I'm going to keep most of it, but I'm going to give you back 1/10 of your stuff." So once the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is added, they've got to be like, scratch that out, right in Salem. We got to have a different person there. So that's probably been edited, and that was probably way too long a response. But the ideas of hospitality and generosity are different between the two. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, the lesson is entirely different. I don't think hospitality and generosity, the way it's being used in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, is as close to the surface in the story of the Good Samaritan. Apologize for taking so long with that. Nate S., thank you for the question. Dan, which is more frustrating, dealing with the people you respond to that aren't honest about your videos, or the Broncos? The Broncos are a lot easier to ignore. If I made my living engaging with the Broncos on social media every day, they would be more frustrating. But the people who aren't honest about my videos are phenomenally frustrating. Rob McFadden, thank you so much for the question. Curious what you think about the documentary hypothesis. I'm reading The Composition of the Pentateuch by Joel Baden, and it's fascinating. Any other books you'd recommend on this? So Joel Baden's the neo-documentary hypothesis, trying to retool the documentary hypothesis to respond to a lot of criticisms and a lot of new data that have come to light. I think Joel is leading the charge on that. I had an interview with Leanne Feldman on the Data Over Dogma podcast, where we talked about her new publication, which is a version of P, an isolation and translation of the priestly source. And she is an acolyte. She is a follower of the neo-documentary hypothesis. I'm not so much a fan of J and E as independent documentary sources. So I would say I'm more of a supplementary hypothesis man myself. Farewell to the Yahwist is a book that discusses the data that suggests there was no Yahwist. I think that's probably one of the, they're all fairly technical, but I think that's one of the better books on that. Another one by Conrad Schmidt, is called Moses and the Genesis and the Moses story, Israel's dual origins in the Hebrew Bible. Schmid is another advocate for something closer to a supplementary hypothesis. And the big disagreement between Joel and Conrad is, were Genesis and Exodus originally two entirely distinct and unrelated traditions that were brought together later? Joel says no. Conrad says yes. I feel that Conrad's argument is probably stronger, but I would say there's not a firm consensus there. Although I think most scholars are moving in the direction of, rather than talking about J, E, P, and D, are talking about P, D, and non-P. So I think we're moving in that direction. And I support that move. Dan, does the Bible support capital punishment? In the Hebrew Bible, it does. There's not our concept of the state didn't exist back then, so there's not a direct correspondence. But absolutely, there were things that they thought were worthy of death, but they usually left it to God to administer that, unless God said, "No, you administer it." And there's a bunch of stuff in the legislation of the Hebrew Bible that calls on the people to execute others. And then you have in the book of Acts, you have, I believe it's Peter, where everybody is selling all their stuff and bringing the proceeds to give to the church. And then you have the two folks who hold back a little bit, and Peter's like, "Oop, sorry, you're dead," and they both die. And some people have argued that the text is unclear on whether God struck them dead or Peter did. So I think the Bible certainly, it doesn't seem to be aware of valid objections to capital punishment. I oppose capital punishment unilaterally. Kip, I expect to see the full beard back in time for the show tomorrow. Unlikely, but it will be back. What's the scholarly consensus on the throw the first stone verse? I've seen some people, not biblical scholars, claim it was added later. The consensus is that it was added later. We do not have that story in the earliest manuscripts. And when we first see it pop up, it is not in the place where it is now. It's kind of moving around in the manuscripts. It's even in the Gospel of Luke in one manuscript. And these are all 4th century and later. So it is absolutely a later addition. What text would you recommend to begin identifying and deploying prototype/family resemblance/discourse-focused approaches to definitions in scholarship? I think John Taylor's book, Linguistic Categorization, is one of the best discussions. And there's I think there's a 3rd edition that's from like, 2003 maybe? Or more recently? Yeah, 3rd edition, Linguistic Categorization, John R. Taylor, Oxford University Press, 2003. Talks about prototypes, talks about lots of different things in that book. I think that's probably one of the best discussions out there right now. Let me see if I have anything else, though. And then we have some folks are doing this in relation to the Bible. Like we have, what is this book? A Prototype Approach to Hate and Anger in the Hebrew Bible, Conceiving Emotions by Dina Grant, which was published this year. I don't remember getting that. But yeah, there are all kinds of different approaches like that. Let's see what this is. Yeah. That's not relevant. Do you have any thoughts on how economic realities and socioeconomic structures that surrounded ancient Israel shaped evolving beliefs about deity? I talk a little bit about that in my book, Adonai's Divine Images. I think in ancient Israel, probably the best discussion I can think of that sits at the intersection of socioeconomic structures and concepts of deity would be a book by Joachim Schaper, and I've probably mispronounced that name. I apologize. Media and Monotheism, Presence, Representation, and Abstraction in Ancient Judah. And part of the point of this is to argue that coinage played a role in developing understandings of representations of deity, because coins could be understood as a species of divine image. So money, the self, the state, and God is one of the chapters. The Judahite weight system, pre-coinage money and the rise of coinage, value abstraction, writing and the rise of a new social formation, value abstraction, the subject/object divide, and monotheism. So it's pretty technical and complex, but that's the one discussion that immediately springs to mind that definitely sits at the overlap of those two things. I'm reading through the OT again right now. Should I read Enoch before I start the New Testament? Yes, I would absolutely recommend that. And I would actually recommend two things that were incredibly influential. One is First Enoch, and the Hermeneia translation is a very inexpensive, accessible one, and the other would be Jubilees. And again, the Hermeneia translation is a very accessible and inexpensive one. So I would definitely recommend that. What's the white whale of biblical scholarship? Like, is there something that possibly exists and everyone wants to find it? Oh, there are a bunch of things. How exactly the Pentateuch came together, where exactly ancient Israel came from, stuff like that. Don Winder, thank you so much for the question. Is Christ just an ancient comic book hero that through time has been set as deity? Will Star Wars /DC/Marvel be misinterpreted as religion in 2,000 years? I doubt that those things will be misinterpreted. Well, no, you do have like a Jedi quasi-religious movement. I don't know that you have it with DC and Marvel superheroes, but some of the characters in there overlap with actual religious traditions, particularly Nordic traditions and things like that. So I think that it's certainly possible, even plausible, that some of these things will turn into things that have religious iterations, but misrepresented, misinterpreted, I don't know about that. And I don't think Jesus is an ancient comic book hero so much as a historical figure that was kind of euhemerized, that became divine through the way the story served the interests of the groups that had followed him when he was alive. C. Scott Davis, thank you so much for the question. Quick question, what does it actually mean to take God's name in vain? I've heard lots of conflicting answers to this. I think, and there are a lot of scholars who think that when it was originally written, this commandment was talking about swearing oaths by God's name. So you see this a lot in the Hebrew Bible. As Adonai lives is an oath that deploys the divine name. Initially, the idea was probably don't swear an oath where you're invoking the divine name if you don't intend to keep it, or if you're just being flippant, because that is evoking the divine name, the divine presence for no real reason, and so that's inappropriate. I think quickly, because it became inappropriate to use the divine name at all, that it had to be renegotiated. And the idea became something more along the lines of don't represent the deity negatively. Don't bear the deity's name in the sense of act as a representative, an image of the deity in a way that is blasphemous or that brings shame upon the divine name or the deity. And it would later, once we get into the Common Era, it would shift even more to this idea of profanity and inappropriate speech, which is how it's frequently used today. But we also have a further elaboration on this idea of don't negatively represent the deity, for people who say, if you identify as a Christian and do evil things, that's violating that commandment. So it has been renegotiated significantly since the original commandment, which probably had to do with swearing oaths that invoked the divine name. Brandon Eller, thank you so much for the question. Do you have a response for "This is my Bible. I am what it says I am. I have what it says I have. What does the Bible say or not say about me?" I'm working on a book right now that is going to be on what the Bible does and doesn't say about a number of issues, but the introduction is going to start off by saying the Bible doesn't say anything at all. It's a text. It has no inherent meaning. It cannot express itself. It can only be deployed in the construction of meaning by readers. And so when we say I am what it says I am, I have what it says I have, really all that's saying is I agree with my construction of my own identity and my own possessions based on my negotiation with the biblical text, which is not saying much at all. Nobody has any choice but to negotiate with the text. Nobody has any pure and unadulterated and unmediated access to the original meaning, because there is no meaning. We are constructing the meaning, and there's a spectrum where we can try to reconstruct this meaning based on our best guess at how it would have been useful and meaningful to the original authors and editors, or we can reconstruct this meaning based on how we can make it useful and meaningful to us today. And so critical scholars are trying to operate on this end of the spectrum. Apologists and a lot of other folks are operating on this end of the spectrum. But the entire spectrum is constructing meaning with the Bible, not excavating meaning from the Bible. Thoughts on Dennis MacDonald's hypothesis on NT use of classical Greek stories via mimesis to convey Jesus' story to a population of predominantly Greek readers? I think there's absolutely something to that. I think to the degree that this is used as an argument for the Jesus tradition being constructed out of whole cloth, which I'm not saying MacDonald is doing that. I don't know if MacDonald is doing that or not, but a lot of other people do that. I think that is going well beyond the data, but certainly there are aspects of the representation of Jesus in the Gospels that are appealing to motifs and turns of phrase and other ideas that are intended to evoke concepts associated with these other deities. LDEM, thank you so much for the question. And thank you, Matt, for your question. Hey, Dan, got a book for Christmas. Not sure if you recommend Demons, Angels, and Writings in Ancient Judaism by Annette Yoshiko Reed. Thoughts? 100% recommend. I would recommend anything that Annette writes and publishes. Annette is a phenomenal scholar. And so that is an awesome book. I have read it myself, and it's a phenomenal discussion. And if you want others by Annette, her 2005 book, Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, The Reception of Enochic Literature, is wonderful. 2017, she published Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism. That's in a more academic press. That's a little more technical, but also a wonderful book. She published a paper in Harvard Theological Review in this last year, 2023. When did daimones become demons? Revisiting Septuagintal data for ancient Jewish demonology, which is also wonderful. So yeah, if you find something by Annette, I would highly recommend it. I have a question. What is a pseudepigrapha, and how is that different from apocrypha, apocryphon? Pseudepigrapha are false writings, so they are writings that are attributed to significant figures from ancient Israel and Judaism that are clearly not. So like an Apocalypse of Abraham and the Assumption of Moses and the Testament of the Patriarchs, and all these texts are pseudepigrapha. Apocrypha is a designation used for a specific set of texts that were originally considered part of the biblical canon until the Reformation, when Luther and others decided we're returning to the Hebrew canon that was settled on by Judaism rather than the Vulgate's canon, which was based on the Greek Septuagint. And so everything that's different, we are pulling out and we're putting in another section. And that was the creation of the apocrypha. So that is a specific set of texts and additions to existing biblical texts. So the apocrypha is a reference to a specific small set of texts. And if you would like more on the apocrypha, there is a book from 2021 by Lawrence Wills that is called Introduction to the Apocrypha, Jewish Books in Christian Bibles. So this I would recommend if you would like to understand more about the Apocrypha. And then there's also, if you are interested in reading the Apocrypha, if you get the SBL Study Bible, as you can see down in the bottom, including apocryphal pseudepigraphical books. So there is the Apocrypha in here, and also introductions to the books of the Apocrypha, as well as explanatory notes, commentary. Or you can go find the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, which is part of the wait a minute, yeah. Doodly-doo. It's the same cover as the New Oxford Annotated Bible, but this is the New Oxford Annotated Apocrypha. So this kind of takes what is included in the SBL Study Bible. It's a different publication, different series, but it's basically an independent publication of what you will find in there. Oh, somebody said Esoterica is a great resource for scholarly work surrounding mystical elements of Judaism and related practice. I would agree with that. From what I've seen of Esoterica, which is not a ton, they seem to do a better job with that kind of stuff than I would. What do you think of the Jesus mythicists? I think they're on the fringe of the academy, and most people don't think there's much to it. Have you had any preview of Dr. Moss's new book? I've talked with her about it at some length, but no, I haven't seen a version of it yet. I hope I will before it comes out, but I haven't seen anything yet. Do you think Matthew was written by a Jewish person or a pro-Torah Gentile? I think Matthew was written by a Judaizer. So probably someone who was a Christian who still believed that the Torah was necessary to be kept, which is why he says the heaven and earth will pass away. Not one single jot or tittle of the law will pass away before heaven and earth. Any connection between the Ugaritic king Daniel and the Daniel of the Bible? There's speculation about that, but we don't really know for sure. Thematically, there's not a ton. There are some kind of squishy connections to make, but we don't really know for sure. Hey, Dan, have you heard this theory that Jesus and Thomas may have been twins? That actually comes from an ancient pseudepigraphical text. If so, could you shed some light on your understanding of it, please? Yeah, the idea is just that Thomas Didymus means Thomas twin. And there's a text where Jesus says, Jesus identifies him as his own twin. From, I believe it's a late 2nd century text, but it's just something that somebody came up with to make the story more interesting. There are no data that suggests any of the biblical texts indicate that. What's a good way to start learning Hebrew? I'm kind of intimidated by the letters. What I did when I first had to start learning the letters was you can find online some worksheets where what they do is One, you just need a chart and you need to go through and try to learn the letters. But then one of the intermediary steps between learning what the letters sound like and actually being able to read the text, what they do is they use Hebrew characters to spell out English names and words. And that is a way to kind of give you a little bit of a hand holding across that bridge, so that if you can kind of pick at, oh, I think this sounds like this and that sounds like that, and oh, that's starting to sound like a word I know, so I can fill in the gaps for the letters that I don't know yet. And that kind of helps you kind of hold your hand through that. So there are some texts that you can Google worksheets that help you with that. Do the Samaritans in their version of the Torah shed light on the Hebrew Bible? Not a ton. We can't entirely dismiss its text critical value. Emmanuel Tove has done a lot of work on the relationship of the Samaritan Pentateuch to things like the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that. And if I recall, it's been a while since I've talked to him about it, but he came down pretty firmly on the side that the Samaritan Pentateuch comes downstream from the Septuagint and other traditions that we see represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so is not text critically more valuable than those other things. Aurora Echo, thank you so much for the question. Thoughts on Jesus comparing himself to the brazen serpent, especially if his deification is a later invention or misunderstanding? Is it prophetic? I don't think it is problematic. I don't think it requires Jesus's deification. I think the idea is that Adonai's agency and power and presence are communicated through Jesus, are indexed by Jesus. And so I talk about the brazen serpent in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, a Cognitive Approach. I develop a theoretical model for what the logic of divine images is, the intuitive logic, why it makes sense to people. And I talk about the brazen serpent as a medium for the communication of God's agency and power and presence. And then in the appendix, I talk about how this could better inform our study of early Christology. And so comparing himself to the serpent, I think, would be entirely appropriate, because Jesus in many ways is functioning as a divine image, as the material medium that manifests God's presence and power and authority, while not actually being the God themselves, which is what divine images were. What can you tell us about the history of the ancient city of Dan? A very ancient city. We have the Bronze Age gates there. We also have later Iron Age gates. We have lots of cool divine images scattered around. There's the temple. And if you go there, it is at the very northern tip of the modern nation of Israel. In fact, there's a little lookout point, like the temple's here, and you kind of walk around and up a little hill, and then there's this lookout point where you're looking north over I don't think it's not Syria, it's Lebanon, I think, that you're looking into, and you can see a city on a hillside on the other side of this valley. It's a fascinating place. It has you can see a river that feeds into, that is a tributary to the Jordan River, that feeds into the Sea of Galilee, literally comes out of the rocks at Dan. You can go, there's like a little nature preserve, and you can go find piles of rocks where there's just water bubbling up out of them, and then it becomes a roaring river by the time you get out of the nature preserve. It's such a fascinating place. I really love that area. But yeah, northern tip of the ancient and modern nation of Israel. Fascinating stuff. I wish I had more information off the top of my head about its origins, but unfortunately I don't. Bizin or Bizin. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Thank you so much for the question. Dan, what are your future books about? The one I'm working on now, don't have a name for it yet, but it's under contract with St. Martin's Press, so an imprint of Macmillan. It's going to be a trade volume. It'll probably be out in early 2025, but it's going to be a bunch of chapters that address what the Bible does or does not say about specific socially salient issues. And then probably the next book after that, I've got a book I want to write on early Christology. So basically taking the framework I developed for my previous book and applying it to early Christology. I will probably expand a paper that I'm going to be presenting in May at a conference at Brown University on, it's called The Meanings and Ends of Monotheism. I put it together with a bunch of friends. We got a bunch of great presenters that are going to talk about why monotheism is not a great analytical category for to apply to the Bible. So I will probably expand that paper into a book. I've got another book that I want to write that was actually what I proposed before St. Martin's came back and said, hey, what if you did this other thing? And I said, great. And that other book would be on how the God of the Bible changes from the earliest literary strata to the latest literary strata. So a lot of things focused on conceptualizations of deity and scripture and religious identity. Vishanti, hey, how are you doing? I realize I'm 24 minutes late to your question, but thank you for being here, and Kip as well. Benjamin, thank you so much for picking up for getting a Date Over Dogma hoodie for Christmas. I hope you get a lot of mileage out of it. Do you think Paul did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus? I do think that Paul did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and that is the academic consensus. What is more accurate to the original meaning of the Hebrew Bible? Septuagint, Masoretic text, Samaritan, Pentateuch, or Dead Sea Scrolls? To be honest, all of them have readings here and there that scholars have argued are probably more original. The Masoretic text, for the most part, is a very reliable text. Excuse me, hang on. Ooh. But we have a lot of things from the Dead Sea Scrolls that show earlier readings. We have a lot of things from the Septuagint that show earlier readings. I would say the Samaritan Pentateuch is probably the least influential in reconstructions of the Hebrew Bible. There's an interesting thing between the Hebrew Bible and New Testament. Hebrew versions of the Hebrew Bible for the longest time have been what are known as diplomatic editions, meaning we've just taken one manuscript and critical editions. So this is a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. It has the text, it has critical apparatus, it has marginal notes. This is all the Leningrad Codex. It is a single manuscript. It's called a diplomatic edition. This is a critical edition of the New Testament. It has the text, it has the critical apparatus, it has marginal notes. This is what's called an eclectic edition. This is not a single manuscript. This is an artificial production based on comparing hundreds and thousands of different manuscripts. So we have cobbled together what we believe is probably the most likely or the earliest reconstructible version of the text based on a bunch of different text critical principles. So this is called an eclectic edition. So Hebrew Bible historically has been used in these diplomatic editions. The Jerusalem Hebrew Bible was an attempt to create an eclectic edition. Didn't really succeed, but now this is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. We've now got Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which is the 5th edition, basically, that is attempting to shift from a diplomatic edition to an eclectic edition. Now it is being released in fascicles, meaning each book or collection of books is being released individually. So this is the version of Genesis from Biblia Hebraica Quinta. So this is an eclectic edition of the Hebrew Bible. And these are, we still have the critical apparatus and everything, but because the scholars have cobbled this together from things like the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, Dead Sea Scrolls, and even other translations, the Vulgate, medieval Hebrew manuscripts, the Syriac, the Targumim, things like that, they kind of have to make a case for why they've done it the way they have. And so half of this is the text, the critical text. And then the other half is discussion of the readings and also interesting text critical issues that they've come across. So this is the cutting edge of critical editions of the Hebrew Bible. And you will see here, they'll say, we think the Septuagint is probably right here. We think this Dead Sea Scroll manuscript is probably right here. And even sometimes we think the Samaritan Pentateuch is probably right here. So I would recommend BHQ if you want to see which manuscripts are being preferred over others. Found the John Taylor book through my university's library website. Awesome. I hope you enjoy it. I really did the first time reading it. Blew my mind in a lot of ways. Thinking of reading the Bible for the first time, do you recommend any special order to read it in, or just go from Genesis to Revelation? That's a that's a tall order. Some people, I think you might get more out of reading the New Testament chronologically, the Hebrew Bible chronologically. I don't think that would do a lot of good, just because a lot of the individual texts have fragments from all over the spectrum, and so you wouldn't be able to actually go earlier to later. New Testament, I think you're more likely to be able to get away with that. But the Hebrew Bible, I would actually read it in the Jewish order rather than the Christian order, because they order the books slightly differently within Judaism. How would you explain John 1:1, and isn't the word the Son? The Logos, the word, is Jesus, yes. John 1:1 says, in the beginning, well, let me just pull it up so I don't misquote anything. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the last part of it, the third clause, ke theos hino logos, which is traditionally translated, and the Word was God. It does not mean the Word was God. It means, and I'll pull up just for fun. What it means is more like the Word was divine, the Word was deity, the Word was a God. It is not identifying Jesus as God. And so here is the Baylor Handbook on the Greek text, John 1 through 10. This is, what year was this published in? I think it's 2020, so this is a little newer. These are really good discussions of all the nuances of the Greek. They also have Baylor Handbooks on the Hebrew text. So when we go to John 1:1, and I've shared videos on this before, that it is the academic consensus among Greek grammarians that theos is being used here qualitatively. In other words, it is not identifying a specific entity. It is talking about a quality. So here we have theos, predicate nominative, fronted for emphasis. It's going to talk about Caldwell's rule, which doesn't apply here. And then it's going to talk about Daniel Wallace, who's the one who kind of set the standard. Wallace's own proposal that the most likely candidate for theos is qualitative, expressing the divine essence of the word while distinguishing him from the person of the Father. Now, that's Trinitarian language. There are no grounds for reading that into John. That idea of multiple persons within one being did not exist when the Gospel of John was written, and there are absolutely no data whatsoever anywhere that indicate otherwise. Seems to me quite plausible because it is consistent with Jesus' claim in the FG that he and the Father are one, yet distinct from one another. If so, theosino logos is not a convertible proposition that presumes complete interchangeability between the subjects and the predicate nominative comparable to a mathematical equation. Rather, a subset proposition is envisioned here. The logos belongs to the larger category known as theos. And I would suggest that in the absence of Trinitarian frameworks, which were absent when John 1 was composed, that's not really up for debate. The larger category, theos, means deity, divine. And God the Father, or God, the God of Israel, did not exhaust the category of divinity or deity in this time period. So Jesus was, the Word was divine, the Word was deity, the Word was a God or a deity. It is not, the Word was God themselves. So it is not a Trinitarian formula at all. Kevin, thank you so much for the question. Does the data support a historical Abraham? No. There are no data that support a historical Abraham, and the Abraham cycle, when we look at it, very clearly reflects the circumstances of a much later time period in ancient Israel, something around the 8th century BCE, not 1,000 years earlier, between 2000 and 1800 BCE. Skeptic Poet, thank you so much for the question. Hey, Dan, what do you think of the argument that Revelation was originally a pure Jewish apocalypse with a Christian editorial layer? I've heard that theory. I'm not convinced by it, nor are most scholars. I've heard a scholarly presentation that was convincing. I don't think it's a very convincing argument. I don't know if it's MacDonald who argues for that, or I forget if that's who argues for it. I know that there's somebody who argues for it. It's not Tabor. Is it Tabor? Kippy, you probably know better than I do, but yeah, I don't find it incredibly convincing. Constellation Pegasus, do you believe Genesis teaches a flat earth and dome cosmology? Yes. The idea in Genesis is that originally there were these chaotic waters, and submerged somewhere in mire and murk was dry land, and then we separated, well, first separated light and dark, separated the waters above from the waters beneath by a dome that literally physically held up the waters above, and then the waters beneath were made to recede so that the dry land could appear. And Israelite cosmology, and if you give me just 1 second, I will pull up what I think is a pretty good illustration of what's going on in Israelite cosmology. Yeah, that's the one. Let's see if I can share this. Share screen. Okay, there we go. So the idea of the circle of the earth, you see that in Job, and people say, oh, that's sphere. That means it's a round earth. No, it means circle. It means a flat circle. Is this idea that the dry land is surrounded by these waters that are delineated by this dome, the waters above the firmament. And so the dome is what, it's blue because it's holding up water. It rains because there are windows in the dome that allow rain to fall. And then you have the dry land has foundations that extend downward, and Sheol is underneath there. So that is more or less, if we had to systematize and schematize how they discuss ancient cosmology, that's what it would look like. So yeah, Genesis is a flat earth idea, even though Job appeals to a lot of different poetry and a lot of different concepts. And so a lot of people like to isolate specific ones and say, oh, it says he said it, upon nothing. That means they knew about, science. And no, it doesn't. Is Exodus 3:14 mistranslated? Should it say I will be rather than I am? So they didn't really have tense in Hebrew, that aspect. So it's either completed action or incompleted action. And this is a first person singular prefix form, so it's incomplete action. So it can be I am and continue to be, or it could be I will be. Some people read it as, hey, I am what I am, kind of a dismissive, it is what it is, saying, none of your business, basically. Or I will be what I will be kind of departs from that a little bit. I think I am what I am, or I am who I am, I think is close enough. But I don't think we can reconstruct enough about the context of the composition of that text to be able to zero in much further than that on how it would have been understood. Slavery in the Bible was mostly indentured servants to learn how to worship. No, slavery in slavery in the Bible is inconsistent. The different law codes treat it in wildly different ways, because these were not the actual law codes that were implemented, that were enforced, that were lived anciently. These are prestige, these are literary exercises, these are scribal exercises, and they conflict with each other in a number of different ways. When your debt slave went free in the 7th year, did you give them money, or did they go out without payment? Exodus says no payment, Deuteronomy says payment. They conflict with each other in a number of different ways. Leviticus 25, 44 through 46a explicitly endorses chattel slavery. That is not indentured servitude in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. Most of the slavery in ancient Israel that was actually lived was probably not indentured servitude in the way we think of it, but debt slavery, and some of it was even sex slavery. And any full-time, like eternal, forever enslaved peoples were probably any that might have been taken in battle or purchased from other nations. And nobody takes praise I am seriously. Sounds like people are getting a little chippy in the commentary. In the comments, anyway. Talking about the Apocrypha 5th edition. There should be a 6th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible coming out soon. I have friends who have told me they've finished their contributions to certain books. So the 6th edition should be coming out soon, and I anticipate, 1, that will incorporate the updated edition, and 2, it will have a lot of new stuff in it. What are your thoughts on who wrote the Gospels? Do you give any credit to Roman scholar propaganda view? No, Roman scholar propaganda view is fringe conspiracy theories. They were written anonymously and originally circulated anonymously, and authorship probably came together piecemeal between around 130, 140 CE and 180 CE, when Irenaeus is the first to actually say, boom, 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 these are the 4 gospel authors. Santo Atheos. Hey, Dan, I've heard, thank you so much for the question. I heard that the Gospel of Matthew we have couldn't have been translated from Aramaic or Hebrew because the Greek would be a different style. How does that work? Thank you. Yes. The translation Greek of this time period, like we find in the Septuagint, like we find in some other places, reflects certain, the source text comes through in a lot of ways. There are ways that the translator is kind of lashed to the source text, and it's not consistent. It only bubbles to the surface in certain places. But if Matthew had been translated from Aramaic or Hebrew, the Greek would be much different. The Greek is fluid. The Greek is fluent. The Greek is natural. It is not suggestive of translation at all. So there's not really an argument to make that Matthew was translated. Philip, thank you again for another question. Cryptic crossword puzzles are one of my passions, and I'm curious if you ever got into them while you studied in the UK. A little bit, but not a ton. I had some friends there who were really into it, and I dabbled a little bit, but never got too into it, mainly because I just didn't have time. I'm a translator by profession, and they scratch my language nerd itch. I really enjoy, like, finishing a puzzle is really gratifying, but I don't know. I've for a long time now, I don't know if it's anxiety. I don't know what it is, but I always have to feel like I'm being productive. And so the only thing there are 2 things that I allow myself to do No, 3 things. One of them I haven't done for a long time, but there are only 3 things I allow myself to do that I am not feeling productive while I'm doing them. Fish, golf, and do artwork. And I have not been drawing for a long time. Unfortunately, I need to get back into it. Constellation Pegasus, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate it. The Babylonian Talmud says burning the guts of a black female kittens and grinding into powder, then rubbing in the eyes allows you to see demons. Sounds like a recipe like drugs to create hallucinations. It could be. It could also just be, kind of eye of newt, just things that they make up. When you look at Mesopotamian medico-magical literature, there's a lot of weird stuff going on there where one might say they, I want whatever they were smoking, but at the same time there's not a lot of evidence a lot of it would really do anything. But in fact, let me see if I have something on that. I thought I had something on medico-magical text, but I don't think I do. But you see a lot of this kind of these potions and medico-magical texts in late antiquity. They're pretty popular within Christianity, within Judaism as well. But I think with Greco-Roman period Judaism, they're so socially conservative and they're so opposed to a lot of the stuff that is more widespread in the social groups around them, that I don't think they would have embedded too much of that kind of stuff into their literature. But I could be entirely wrong there. But thanks for a great question. I'll have to look into that a little bit. Chris Eldridge, thank you so much for the question. Hey, Dan, I've read that the Israelite religion borrowed elements from Zoroastrianism during the Persian period. Is there much evidence in and outside of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, to support this? A lot of it's circumstantial. I think it is almost certain that Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism and into Christianity, particularly with its dualism and perhaps concepts of angels, concepts of evil deities. But I've said it a number of times before, there are not a lot of experts in Judaism who are also experts in Old Persian and Iranian history. That's an overlap you don't get an awful lot of, so there are not a ton of people who can work in that intersection. However, there are a number of texts that I've pointed to in the past. I think the best thing you're going to get that discusses this intersection is the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism. And that looks like this. And if you go down to, excuse me, I'm gonna have to go start to get dinner ready here. Part 1, Zarathustra Revisited. Part 2, Periods, Regions, and Contexts. Part 3, Structures, Discourses, and Dimensions. Part 4, Practices and Sites. And then Part 5, Intersections. That's where we've got a discussion on intersections with Judaism, the classical world, Mithra to Roman Mithras, how that deity was borrowed from Zoroastrianism into Roman religion, Christianity, Manichaeism in Iran. So, and then you got primary sources. So I think that would be a good text for understanding where things stand. It's from 2015, so it's going on 9 years old. But that's probably going to have the best information on where the scholarship stands on the relationship of Judaism to Zoroastrianism. All right. Dan, do you believe Mary was Jesus' wife? I think it's possible, but this is another thing where I kind of suspend judgment. I don't think we have enough data to make that determination, and anyone who feels... I think it's probably more likely than not that Mary was not Jesus's wife, but more like 60-40, more than like 80-20 or 90-10. But people who think they know for certain one way or another are just assuming. How was Jesus worshipped in the first century? As a sort of lesser deity, God's wisdom, or something else entirely? I think probably worshipped in the same way that a divine image was worshipped, that this is the material entity that manifests God's presence and power, and so we can access God and worship God through this material media. The earliest reference that we have from outside Christianity to how Christians worshipped is from Pliny. Pliny the Younger, who wrote a letter to the Roman emperor and said, "Hey, I came across these Christians. I tortured some of them. Some of the women were enslaved people, and in Rome, a confession was only good, only had legitimacy in the courts for an enslaved person if it was acquired through torture. So Pliny tortures the women. If they denounced Christianity, or if they, did their offering to the emperor, I let them go. If they didn't, I killed them." Writing to the emperor saying, "Did I do good? What should I do here?" And the emperor said, "You did good, kid." But Pliny describes their worship. Says they gather early in the morning and sing hymns to this Jesus as if to a god. Let's see if there are any other details. What does Pliny say? Okay, it says they meet on a certain day before light, where they gather and sing hymns to Christ as to a god. They all bind themselves by oath, not to some crimes, says Pliny, as though that is what he would have expected. Rather, they pledge not to commit any crimes such as fraud, theft, or adultery, and subsequently share a meal of ordinary and innocent food. And this kind of stands at odds with what Pliny had heard they did. There was a lot of, they sacrifice children, they are cannibals, they do weird sex stuff, kind of standard when we want to demonize somebody, here's what we accuse them of. Okay, I'm going to have to go in a minute or two. Time Lord 93, thank you so much for the question. I appreciate it. I saw a video by Tobias Singer where he says the resurrection account is fictional. I mean, resurrection from the dead is a physical impossibility, so it doesn't seem like there's a strong case that can be made otherwise, despite the whole minimal facts argument, which doesn't just entirely ignores what cognitive science and cognitive psychology have been doing for many years now. Women wouldn't anoint a dead male body by Jewish custom. Thoughts? There would have been folks whose job it would have been to do that, and whether or not the women would have been able to do that, I am not. That is something I don't recall knowing about any specific injunction. There certainly would have been women who would have been hired to be mourners and whose jobs it would have been to do certain things associated with the burial, but a prohibition on anointing a dead male body, I don't know that we can say that for sure, but I'll have to look into that. But Singer gets a lot of stuff wrong, or excuse me, I was going to say gets a lot of stuff right, but at the same time goes well beyond the data on some other things and turns some questionable assumptions into assertions. And so, but on this specific one, I don't know. I have never heard in the accounts I have read arguments for and against the historicity of the story of the burial and the resurrection. This is not something I recall having seen brought up. So I'll have to look further into that. I don't know off the top of my head. Evergreen, thank you for the question. Are the Gospels in agreement that the Messiah have to be from the line of David? I've heard that Jesus was apparently arguing with Pharisees about that. I don't know that they had to have, the Gospels couldn't kind of create that expectation. I don't know that they all agree that it had to be that way. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually see discussion of two different Messiahs, a Messiah ben Joseph and a Messiah ben David. So they were expecting different kinds of Messiahs. So there was space for a non-Davidic Messiah, but the Gospels in the Jesus tradition, their primary habit was to consolidate all these traditions within Jesus. And so rather than say, no, we're that not part of the Jesus tradition, it was usually, bring that in. We're going to add that to the Jesus tradition. So they were more cumulative rather than selective. So I think that they would not have gone with a non-Davidic Messiah, even though I don't know that it was really a requirement. Skeptic Poet, thank you for another question. Any concerns with Christus versus Christos? The same? Yeah, the same. In fact, we see that spelling in Codex Sinaiticus, for instance, where the couple of times that the word Christian appears, it is Christian. And I think there are even a couple of references to Jesus where it's Christus, and it's kind of scratched out or written over. So yes, that was a spelling. I don't know if it was an encoding versus just a variant pronunciation versus a variant spelling, but we do have data that indicate that was a way to refer to Jesus. So if you're bringing up the Tacitus account, if that was really a reference to Jesus or to some other group, the good ones, it was certainly a reference to Jesus. All right, I'm going to scoot down a little bit closer to the bottom. I'm sorry, I cannot seem to get less than 30 minutes away from the questions. My apologies for not being able to keep up. But sometimes we stumble on some things that I just need to feel like ranting about for a while. The Bible is 100% true. I don't think there are many data that support that. Dan refuses to make his true beliefs transparently. He just presents the data, atheist scholars' consensus. Actually, the overwhelming majority of the stuff that I present is supported by believing scholars, Jewish, Christian, and other. Although I have no issue with atheist scholars either. And it's not my true beliefs that I refuse to make transparent. It is my religious beliefs, because they are irrelevant, because my scholarship is untethered from my religious beliefs. And I have demonstrated that time and time and time again. Hey, Dan, before you go, are there misinformation that has been transmitted from Christianity into Islam? Some of the traditions about Jesus that we find in Islam are rooted in 2nd and 3rd century traditions, whether Gnostic or otherwise, that have made their way into the Quran and the traditions about Jesus. So I wouldn't call it misinformation so much as I would call it later traditions, but yeah, certainly. Dan is a Melchizedek in the, oh, you mean a Melchizedek priesthood holder? Yes. Dan, your religious beliefs are not irrelevant. Yes, they are. I am interested in them because they necessarily color what you accept or reject. No, they don't. You have criticized the traditional concept of God. Yes, I have. I have also criticized the Latter-day Saint concept of God, and the Latter-day Saint concept of Scripture, and the Latter-day Saint concept of history, and everything else about Latter-day Saint tradition. Regarding my super chat, see example Luke 20:41. Let's see what we got here. Luke 20:41. Oh, how say they that Christ is David's son? So that's about Psalm 110, where the Lord said unto my Lord, or at least that's the response that Jesus offers. Christ is David's son, and that could be interpreted a few different ways. We could understand it in the sense that David was, died 1,000 years before. So how could he be his son? It could be interpreted to refer to skepticism about the possibility of the Davidic line being recoverable. There are a few different ways that could be interpreted, but I don't know that there was, when it comes to a requirement that the Messiah be David's son, there was the notion that was a requirement. I think certain people would have definitely held to, but there would certainly be people who did not see that as a requirement. Everyone's beliefs color what they reject. Yes, they do. But those of us who professionally study how our beliefs color our perception of the world are able to then mitigate the influence of those intuitions on what we actually put out into the public. See, I'm a cognitive scientist of religion. I study how people's beliefs are influenced by their environment, by their cognition, by all of these different things. And so you have never spoken to anyone in your entire life who worries more about how their biases affect their discourse and their beliefs than me. And so I am influenced by things, and then I interrogate how I have been influenced by those things. And not 100% of the time, but the overwhelming majority of the time, if something makes it all the way out of my mouth and onto a video, I have already worried for days and weeks about what kind of influence my biases may have had on that. And I have taken out, or to the degree possible, mitigated the influence of those biases. So I'm not saying it's impossible for anybody to be 100% on that. But when it comes to what I put online, no, it's not influenced by my Mormonism. And you can go find any video you want that I've ever published on my channel. You will never find a video that you can demonstrate is me promoting Mormonism over and against what the scholarship would determine. If there is overlap, it is overlap between a superficial understanding of an LDS doctrine and the scholarly consensus. And my concern will be the scholarly consensus. Nate S., thanks for all you do, Dan. Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm happy to do it. Although I do have to go because I've got to take care of some things before I go to find some dinner for the family. So thank you, everybody, for your time. I appreciate the great questions. I appreciate your support, and I will, I will be back at some point next week. Hang on. I saw something from Kip. Reed Uberman says you are totally biased, smug scholar. Well, I don't know who Reed Uberman is. Dan, my problem is that you say I have never met someone who worries more about their bias than you, but how do you know that? Because I study it for a living, and the way you talk about this shows me that you don't talk to people who study this for a living. I have not claimed anything you say is influenced by your Mormonism, by the way. You directly claimed that. Hi, Dan. We were discussing the Quran in relation to Torah/Gospels. Is the Quran a sequel to other texts or standalone texts that employs them? I think it's a standalone, but I think it ropes in some of those other traditions. But like I said, later iterations of some of those traditions for the most part. Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down in other discussions, but thank you, everybody, for your time. I've got to go now. And I will see you all around some point next week.